Tonight, I've gathered some of the darkest and most chilling true horror stories from across the internet. Stories whispered in forgotten forums, buried in late-night Reddit threads, and shared by people who swore they'd never speak of it again. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? Are you lying in bed with the lights off, listening during a midnight drive, or maybe you're just trying to make it through the night shift? Get comfortable, put your headphones in, and whatever you do, don't look behind you. Let's begin. When I was 26, my best friend Mike convinced me to go camping in the remote forests of Colorado, far from cell service and the distractions of everyday life. We both needed a break from work and agreed that spending a weekend deep in the wilderness would recharge us. Neither of us had much camping experience, but Mike was confident we'd figure it out, and his enthusiasm was contagious. We drove for hours along winding mountain roads, finally arriving at the trailhead as dusk began settling in. From there, we hiked deeper into the forest, eager to find a secluded spot near a river that Mike had found on a map. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine trees, and everything felt peaceful, exactly what we'd been hoping for. After setting up camp and building a small fire, we spent the evening chatting, laughing, and roasting marshmallows. Darkness soon swallowed the forest, leaving us surrounded by nothing but flickering firelight and shadows cast from towering trees. Eventually, we grew tired and decided to turn in for the night, extinguishing the fire carefully and crawling into our separate tents. Sleep came quickly for me, the gentle sounds of nature creating a soothing lullaby. But sometime later, I awoke abruptly, disoriented at first. I quickly realized something had disturbed me, a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere outside my tent. I sat up slowly, heart beating faster, listening carefully. At first, I convinced myself it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or raccoon, wandering near our campsite. But moments later, a distinctly human noise broke through the quiet, a soft muffled cough, unmistakably close. My breath caught painfully, adrenaline spiking sharply. Carefully and silently, I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly, as I quietly unzipped my tent, just enough to peek out. At first, the darkness revealed nothing, but then, barely visible in the moonlight, I saw a figure standing motionless at the edge of our campsite, staring directly toward our tents. My blood turned ice cold instantly. The person stood perfectly still, silent, just watching us. My mind raced frantically. Who were they? And how had they found us here? Miles from civilization. Fear tightened its grip painfully. Just as I considered calling out to Mike, the figure suddenly turned and walked slowly back into the darkness, disappearing completely among the trees. I waited anxiously for several tense minutes, listening carefully, before finally whispering urgently toward Mike's tent. "Mike, wake up," I hissed quietly. Someone was out here. Mike stirred immediately, asking nervously what I'd seen. I explained quickly, hearing the tension rise in his voice. He emerged from his tent cautiously, flashlight in hand, and together we scanned the forest around us, our beams of light piercing through the shadows. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone. After checking the area thoroughly, Mike convinced me it was probably just another camper who'd gotten lost or had wandered too close unintentionally. Reluctantly, I agreed, and we eventually returned to our tents. Though sleep remained impossible, every rustle, every crack of branches made my heart jump painfully. Morning brought relief, sunlight, chasing away some of the night's fear. We quickly packed up camp, deciding to hike further along the trail to find a different spot, hoping distance would ease our minds. By midday, we found a clearing beside a small stream, deciding it felt safe enough to settle again. But even in the daylight, anxiety lingered persistently. As evening approached, we built another small fire, attempting to reclaim some of the enjoyment we'd lost the previous night. But as darkness enveloped the forest once again, the oppressive silence felt heavier than ever. Both of us jumped nervously at every sound, laughing anxiously at our paranoia. Eventually, exhaustion overcame anxiety, and we retreated cautiously into our tents once more. But sleep refused to come easily. Hours passed restlessly. Then, just as I finally began drifting off, a sound jolted me awake. A sudden sharp snap of branches, heavy and unmistakably close. Fear surged through me instantly. Before I could react, another noise followed. The sound of footsteps quietly approaching our campsite. Whoever was out there had followed us here, tracking us carefully through the forest. This was no coincidence. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the footsteps paused, just outside my tent, lingering quietly, breathing softly. Every muscle in my body froze, terror gripping me tightly, as I waited desperately for the intruder's next move. My entire body was rigid with fear, heart pounding painfully, as the person outside my tent stood utterly still, breathing softly, deliberately. Each second stretched out agonizingly, magnifying my anxiety. Who were they? Why had they tracked us through miles of dense, isolated forest? Then, suddenly, a voice whispered softly into the darkness, deep, calm, and frighteningly composed. "I know you're awake in there." Chills crawled violently down my spine. My breath caught sharply, as panic surged through me. I lay frozen, barely daring to breathe. The intruder moved slowly, footsteps shifting closer, standing directly outside the thin fabric separating us. I heard him softly touch my tent, fingertips tracing gently along the nylon. "You shouldn't camp out here alone," the voice murmured, a faint amusement beneath his calm tone. Bad things happen in these woods. Paralyzed by dread, I struggled to stay silent, knowing any sound could reveal me fully. Just then, I heard Mike stirring in his tent, evidently awakened by the whispers. The intruder heard too, immediately turning toward Mike's tent and stepping slowly closer. My pulse thundered violently, desperation overwhelming me. I had to act quickly. With trembling fingers, I quietly found my phone, praying I'd have some signal. Miraculously, one tiny bar flickered faintly. I dialed emergency services, whispering urgently into the phone that someone dangerous was threatening us in the wilderness. The dispatcher responded calmly, assuring me help was on its way, instructing me to remain quiet and hidden. Outside, the intruder continued speaking quietly, now addressing Mike directly. "You're awake too, aren't you? Come on out. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I held my breath, silently praying Mike wouldn't respond, hoping he could sense the danger. After several torturous seconds of silence, the intruder's voice turned colder, frustration creeping into his tone. "I don't have all night," he hissed softly. "If you won't come out, I'll have to come in." My heart nearly stopped entirely. I heard a sudden rustling as Mike abruptly emerged from his tent, confronting the man. Mike's voice shook with tension, trying to sound calm but unable to fully mask his fear. "Look, just leave us alone," Mike pleaded anxiously. "We didn't mean to disturb anyone." The intruder chuckled softly, chillingly composed. "I'm not disturbed," he murmured gently. "I was hoping you'd wander further from the trail. Actually, people get lost out here so easily." Realizing the seriousness of the situation, I quietly prepared myself, gripping my flashlight tightly as an improvised weapon, hoping desperately police would arrive before anything terrible happened. Outside, Mike tried reasoning again. "We'll leave right now, okay? Just let us pack up, and we'll be gone." But the man interrupted sharply, his voice suddenly harsher, angrier. "It's too late for that." Fear surged violently through me. Before I could fully react, a sudden scuffle broke out, sounds of struggling and grunts of effort breaking through the silence. Realizing Mike was fighting back, adrenaline overtook me. Without thinking, I burst from my tent, shining my flashlight toward the commotion. The sudden beam illuminated a terrifying scene. Mike was wrestling desperately with a large, heavily built man in a dark jacket, a hunting knife gripped tightly in the man's hand. Without hesitation, I rushed forward, screaming loudly to distract the attacker, shining the blinding light directly into his eyes. Startled, the man briefly loosened his grip on Mike, stumbling backward momentarily. Mike seized the opportunity, striking him hard, knocking the knife from his hand. Before the attacker could regain control, distant voices shouted urgently from the darkness, Police officers had finally arrived, rushing swiftly toward us with flashlights and guns drawn. The intruder cursed violently, attempting to flee, but officers quickly apprehended him, tackling him firmly to the ground. As police secured the attacker, Mike and I stood shaking uncontrollably, adrenaline still pumping fiercely. Officers later revealed chilling details. The man was a wanted fugitive, named Garrett Hughes, responsible for multiple disappearances in these remote forests over recent years. He'd stalked campers quietly, choosing isolated victims who wouldn't immediately be missed, luring them deeper into wilderness before attacking. Mike and I had unknowingly become his latest targets. The knowledge of how narrowly we'd escaped left us deeply shaken. After giving statements, police guided us back safely to our vehicle, urging us to return home immediately. We drove silently through the night, too traumatized to speak, forever changed by the terrifying realization of what could have happened if help had arrived even seconds later. I was 25 when I took a summer job at Meadow Creek Resort, an isolated lodge nestled deep within Montana's vast mountainous wilderness. The resort was known for its breathtaking views and tranquil seclusion, attracting visitors who wanted to disconnect from society. My role was simple: assist guests with outdoor activities, handle basic tasks around the lodge, and ensure everyone had a comfortable stay. Initially, I loved the solitude. The lodge was picturesque, surrounded by dense forests and trails winding through tall pines. Most of our guests were quiet couples or families looking for peaceful retreats. There was a small staff: myself, a cook named Elise, and the manager Frank, an older man who rarely spoke more than necessary. One July evening, after most guests had checked out, and before new arrivals came, Frank asked me to check on a hiking trail leading up to Crystal Lake, a secluded spot deep in the woods. Some guests had reported that trail markers were missing, and Frank wanted me to replace them before the next group arrived. Though the hike would take several hours, I eagerly accepted, looking forward to exploring the beautiful terrain alone. The weather was perfect as I set out, the late afternoon sun warm on my back. Birds chirped overhead, and the soft sound of wind rustled the branches gently. For a while everything felt peaceful, exactly as I'd hoped. But as I ventured further from the lodge, the atmosphere gradually shifted. The forest grew thicker, darker, almost oppressive. Silence replaced the cheerful birdsongs, creating a strange sense of isolation. Suddenly, I felt uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I dismissed the thought, convincing myself it was paranoia brought on by the dense surroundings. About halfway to the lake, I stopped to replace a marker, hammering the small wooden post firmly into the ground. As I straightened up, something caught my eye in the distance, a subtle movement between the trees, barely visible. I froze, squinting into the shadowy forest. At first, I saw nothing, but then, unmistakably, a figure moved quietly from behind one tree to another. My pulse quickened sharply. Was someone following me? Or perhaps another hiker? I called out nervously, "Hello, is someone there?" Silence answered back. After several tense moments, I shook my head, forcing a nervous laugh. Surely it was just an animal, or my imagination playing tricks. Determined not to let anxiety get the better of me, I pressed onward toward Crystal Lake, now walking quicker, senses heightened. Yet the unsettling feeling persisted, the sensation of unseen eyes following my every step. When I finally reached the lake, twilight had started painting the sky in shades of purple and orange. Crystal Lake was stunning, calm waters reflecting the fading sunlight beautifully. Despite the view, however, my unease refused to fade. Quickly placing the final markers along the shoreline, I prepared to head back, eager to return before nightfall fully set in. But as I turned to retrace my steps, something stopped me instantly, a quiet sound drifting softly across the water. At first, I thought it was just the wind whispering through trees, but moments later, I realized it was unmistakably human. Someone was humming softly, a slow, haunting tune, coming from somewhere on the opposite side of the lake. My skin prickled with chills, anxiety gripping me tightly. The lake was remote, miles from any trail or campsite. Who else would be out here, especially so late? Carefully, quietly, I moved toward the source of the humming, curious yet terrified. As I approached, the humming abruptly stopped, replaced by a heavy silence. I paused, heart hammering violently, straining my ears desperately. Then a soft rustling sound filled the air. The person had moved again, shifting through thick bushes near the shoreline. Fear surged through me sharply, summoning courage. I called out shakily again, "Who's there? Are you lost?" A pause followed, heavy and long. Finally, a voice answered back softly, a woman's voice, calm yet oddly detached. "I'm never lost out here." Her words sent fresh chills crawling down my spine. I cautiously stepped closer, my eyes finally catching sight of her, clearly through the shadows. A young woman standing near the water's edge, facing away from me, long dark hair cascading down her back. "Are you okay?" I asked nervously, my voice shaking slightly. She didn't turn around, only spoke again, voice gentle but unsettlingly distant. "I'm fine. You're the one who's far from home." Confused, I took another careful step forward. "I'm staying at Meadow Creek Resort. Do you need help getting back?" She laughed softly, a chilling sound that froze me instantly. "No, I've always been here," she murmured, turning slowly toward me at last. My breath caught sharply as I saw her face clearly, eyes wide, dark, and unsettlingly intense. She stared directly at me, expression calm yet strangely emotionless. Without warning, she smiled gently, eerily. "You shouldn't wander this deep into the forest alone," she whispered quietly. "Not everyone out here is friendly." Before I could respond, she stepped silently backward into thick brush, vanishing swiftly, leaving me frozen, heart pounding painfully, terrified by the bizarre encounter. Realizing how vulnerable I was out here, alone and miles from safety, I quickly turned, moving swiftly back along the trail toward the lodge, unable to shake the haunting memory of her strange warning and that chilling, calm smile. The darkness deepened rapidly as I hurried back down the trail, every shadow growing larger and more sinister with each passing moment. My encounter at Crystal Lake replayed repeatedly in my mind, the mysterious woman's calm, unsettling smile, and her quiet warning echoing hauntingly in my thoughts. Despite quickening my pace, the feeling of being watched only intensified. Branches cracked softly behind me, rustling footsteps matching mine, always just beyond view. My heart hammered violently. Was it her, or someone else entirely? Each glance over my shoulder revealed nothing but darkness, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that someone, or something was following close behind. Finally, the welcoming glow of the lodge appeared faintly ahead, promising safety. Relief surged through me, urging my tired legs forward. Bursting into the lodge lobby breathlessly, I nearly collided with Elise, the cook, who was startled by my frantic entrance. She saw my pale, frightened expression, and quickly asked, "What happened? Are you all right?" Struggling to catch my breath, I told her about the strange encounter at Crystal Lake, and the feeling of being followed. Elise listened closely, her expression growing serious. After a brief pause, she glanced around cautiously, and spoke softly, almost whispering, "You saw her too, didn't you?" Confused and alarmed, I asked who she meant. Elise glanced nervously toward Frank's office, then leaned closer, speaking quietly but urgently. "There's a local legend around here. People call her the Lake Watcher. They say she's lived alone in the forest for years, avoiding people, protecting the woods. Most dismiss her as a myth, but every so often, hikers report strange encounters, always describing the same woman you saw." My heart skipped sharply. "Is she dangerous?" Elise hesitated. "No one knows for sure, but Frank always insisted she was just a harmless story, meant to scare campers from wandering too far." Just then, Frank emerged from his office, interrupting us abruptly, asking what was wrong. Elise quickly fell silent, clearly uncomfortable discussing the legend further. Nervously, I explained again about the woman, expecting Frank to dismiss me immediately. Instead, his expression darkened noticeably, surprising me. "I warned you not to go off trail," he said sternly, anger creeping into his voice. "The Lake Watcher is trouble. You're lucky she let you leave unharmed." Startled by Frank's serious tone, I realized Elise was telling the truth. This wasn't just some local ghost story. Frank quickly told us both to lock up and head straight to our cabins, urging us not to wander outside at night anymore. His concern was clear, deepening my anxiety further. That night, sleep felt impossible. Every noise outside my window sent chills racing down my spine. Just past midnight, however, a soft tapping suddenly sounded against my cabin's window pane. Faint, rhythmic, deliberate. I sat up sharply, heart pounding violently. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the window, pulling aside the curtain slightly, peering into the darkness. Standing calmly beneath pale moonlight was the woman from the lake, staring silently toward me, eyes wide and unblinking, expression calm, but strangely sad. I froze in terror, breath caught painfully. She lifted a single finger gently to her lips, signaling for silence, then slowly raised her other hand, pointing quietly toward Frank's cabin nearby. My gaze shifted instantly, confusion mixing sharply with fear. At first I saw nothing unusual, but suddenly, Frank emerged silently from his cabin, glancing anxiously around before disappearing quickly into the darkness. Walking hurriedly toward the woods, my stomach twisted sickeningly. What was Frank doing out at night? I turned back toward the woman, but she'd vanished again, leaving me utterly bewildered. Despite my anxiety, curiosity overtook fear. Quietly, carefully, I slipped from my cabin, moving stealthily toward the trees, determined to uncover whatever secret Frank was hiding. I followed his path cautiously, moving silently through darkness, until I reached a small clearing far from the lodge. Concealed by shadows, I watched, my heart nearly stopping entirely, as Frank stepped forward, meeting another man who stood waiting quietly. Someone unfamiliar, face concealed by darkness. Their hushed conversation quickly turned heated. I strained to listen, barely catching fragments, words like dangerous, authorities and evidence drifting faintly through the night air. Then, clearly audible, Frank's voice rose angrily. "We need to move faster. People are starting to notice. She's seen too much already." My pulse skyrocketed violently. Were they talking about me? Before I could react, the stranger nodded sharply, retreating silently into darkness, while Frank turned swiftly back toward the lodge. Terrified of being caught, I slipped quietly away, racing desperately toward my cabin, panic gripping me tightly. Once safely inside, realization struck hard. Frank had something terrible to hide. Something involving dangerous secrets in these woods. Was the mysterious woman truly warning me of him all along? Early the next morning, police vehicles suddenly arrived, officers approaching the lodge urgently. Confused staff gathered anxiously, as they explained grimly that Frank had been under investigation for months, suspected of being involved in criminal activities linked to several disappearances in the area. Frank was quickly taken into custody, his secret finally exposed. In the aftermath, I learned the chilling truth. Frank had quietly used the isolation of the lodge to assist a criminal partner in trafficking illegal goods, willing to do anything, including harming curious employees, to protect their operation. The mysterious woman, the lake watcher, wasn't the threat at all. Instead, she'd been silently protecting hikers from wandering into Frank's dark secrets. Though the lodge quickly closed afterward, I never forgot my encounter with her quiet, watchful presence, nor the terrifying realization of how close I'd unknowingly come to danger. At 28, I finally fulfilled my dream of owning a small bookstore in a quiet neighborhood of Seattle. The shop was nestled on an old street lined with brick buildings, charming cafes, and small boutiques. It was exactly what I'd always wanted. A peaceful life surrounded by books, and the gentle rhythm of quiet, loyal customers. My bookstore, the reading nook, quickly found its place in the community, attracting regular visitors who browsed quietly through the shelves, chatting politely, and sharing recommendations. Among my regular customers was a man named Ethan. He appeared friendly, soft-spoken and polite, though unusually reserved. He visited frequently, but rarely spoke much, always purchasing one book at a time, and leaving quietly. At first, Ethan seemed harmless, just another introverted reader who enjoyed the solitude of the bookstore. However, as the weeks passed, his behavior grew increasingly peculiar. He started coming in almost every day, lingering for hours at a time, watching me from behind shelves and stacks of books. His eyes would follow me as I moved around, a quiet, subtle gaze that gradually grew unsettling. Initially, I tried to brush it off, convincing myself he was shy, or perhaps socially awkward, but soon I began noticing small disturbances around the store. Books would be slightly rearranged or opened to specific pages with strange passages highlighted. At first, I dismissed this as coincidence or customers being careless, but it quickly became clear someone was deliberately leaving messages for me, words and sentences marked carefully, hinting at loneliness, obsession, and hidden intentions. Then, one evening after closing, I discovered something far more disturbing. As I locked the doors and began tidying up, I noticed an unfamiliar notebook tucked discreetly on a shelf near my desk. Curious, I opened it, my blood turning cold as I flipped through its pages. Inside were countless notes, written neatly and meticulously. Each entry detailed observations about me, my daily routine, what I wore, even my conversations with other customers. Every detail, down to the exact minute I arrived and left each day, was carefully recorded. I felt sick to my stomach, fear gripping me tightly. Who had done this? And why were they so obsessively tracking me? At the back of the notebook, a series of drawings sent chills crawling down my spine. Sketches of me, captured from memory, with disturbing accuracy. Beneath each sketch were unsettling notes. "You're safe with me. I'll never let anyone hurt you." My breath caught painfully as I frantically flipped back through pages, finally spotting a familiar handwriting style. The same elegant script Ethan always used when signing receipts. Horrified, I dropped the notebook, immediately dialing the police, my voice shaking uncontrollably as I explained the situation. When officers arrived, I showed them the notebook. They agreed it was deeply concerning, and promised they'd look into Ethan. However, without direct evidence of threats, they could only advise vigilance and caution. They left, promising to patrol frequently, yet offering little comfort. I barely slept that night, haunted by images from the notebook. The following morning, I anxiously opened the shop, unable to shake the heavy anxiety hanging over me. To my relief, Ethan didn't appear all day. Hours passed quietly, and I began to hope he had moved on, or had gotten the message. But as evening approached, my relief shattered instantly. While organizing a display near the window, movement caught my eye. Glancing up, my pulse spiked. Across the street, standing motionless beneath the pale glow of a street lamp, was Ethan, staring directly at me, eyes cold and unblinking, frozen with dread. I stared back helplessly, heart hammering. Ethan made no move toward the bookstore. He simply stood calmly, openly watching, unbothered by the pedestrians passing around him. After several agonizing minutes, he finally turned away, disappearing slowly down the street into the gathering darkness, closing early out of fear. I hurried home, desperate for safety, yet even there, anxiety lingered. The bookstore had once felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt violated, unsafe. Ethan's silent, persistent watching felt inescapable, his obsession clearly escalating from quiet observation into something far darker and more threatening. Late that night, a soft notification ping woke me abruptly. Someone had messaged the bookstore's social media page. Dread twisted painfully in my stomach as I read the message from a fake account. Its words simple yet horrifyingly clear. "Did you like my drawings? Don't worry, soon you'll see what I've been planning." Terrified, I sat frozen in my apartment, realizing with chilling certainty that Ethan's obsession had moved beyond mere watching. He intended something far more sinister, and clearly wasn't afraid to reveal it anymore. My pulse thundered painfully in my ears as I stared at the threatening message glowing coldly on my phone screen. The reality of Ethan's obsession sank deeply into me, a suffocating weight of dread. His fixation had clearly escalated from quiet, unsettling observation into something much darker, more sinister. Immediately, I called the police again, this time showing them Ethan's message as proof of direct threats. Officers assured me they'd question him immediately, and warned me to be cautious, advising that I not be alone, especially in the bookstore. Though their words were meant to comfort me, they only heightened my anxiety. The next day, 2 officers visited the bookstore early, informing me grimly that Ethan's apartment was empty. When they arrived, he seemed to have vanished overnight. My fear spiked sharply. If Ethan had fled, it meant he could now be anywhere, waiting patiently, perhaps closer than ever. I quickly closed the store for the day, unable to bear the thought of Ethan returning unnoticed. Back in my apartment, anxiety consumed me completely. I checked locks obsessively, startling at every sound, every creak, convinced Ethan was nearby, silently watching. Days passed in constant tension. Ethan didn't reappear, but the fear he left behind lingered heavily. Sleep became scarce, replaced by paranoia and exhaustion. Friends urged me to temporarily leave the city, to stay somewhere safer until the situation calmed, but stubbornness and pride kept me rooted, determined not to let Ethan steal away the life I'd worked so hard to build. Then came a rainy night that finally pushed my stubborn bravery beyond its breaking point. As I sat alone in my apartment, curled up anxiously on the couch, the light suddenly flickered and went out, plunging me into absolute darkness. My heart immediately raced in panic. Grabbing my phone as a flashlight, I stepped nervously toward the kitchen, assuming it was merely a blown fuse. But before I could reach the breaker box, a noise broke through the silence, a quiet scraping sound coming from just outside my apartment door. I froze instantly, blood running cold, breath caught painfully in my throat. The sound repeated, deliberate and clear. Someone was standing just outside, running something sharp slowly along the wooden doorframe. Trembling, I moved quietly toward the door, my phone shaking violently as I dialed 911 again, whispering urgently to the dispatcher that someone was attempting to break in. She calmly advised me to remain silent, find a hiding spot, and assured me help was already on its way. Seconds later, a voice came softly from the hallway, a voice I knew with chilling certainty belonged to Ethan. "I know you're in there," he whispered gently, calmly. "You can't hide forever. I've been waiting too long." His calmness terrified me more than anger ever could. Quietly, I retreated to my bedroom closet, pulling the door shut silently, desperately praying Ethan wouldn't force his way inside before help arrived. Minutes dragged on endlessly, filled with oppressive silence punctuated by occasional soft footsteps outside, moving patiently, deliberately. Then, without warning, the unmistakable sound of wood cracking filled the apartment. He was forcing open the door. Fear surged painfully through me. Within moments, the sound of footsteps entered, calmly pacing through the darkness, as if Ethan had done this 100 times before. "Don't be afraid," Ethan's voice murmured softly. "I did this for us. Everything was for you." His voice moved closer, footsteps pausing outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, panic tightening my chest painfully. The bedroom door slowly creaked open, Ethan stepping inside, breathing softly, unhurried, calm. He moved around the room quietly, methodically searching, eventually pausing directly outside the closet door, where I crouched, terrified and trapped. The closet door handle twisted slowly, gently. Ethan spoke softly, soothingly. "You don't have to hide from me. We're supposed to be together." My entire body shook violently, tears burning my eyes, as Ethan began pulling the closet door open slowly. At that exact moment, sirens erupted loudly from outside, lights flashing brightly through the windows. Ethan cursed softly, footsteps retreating quickly through the apartment. Seconds later, police burst inside, calling my name. Relief flooded me completely. Officers found me shaking uncontrollably in the closet, guiding me gently to safety. Ethan had fled, vanishing once again into the night. Police searched relentlessly, eventually apprehending Ethan the following day, hiding in a nearby abandoned building. They later revealed disturbing details of his fixation. He'd carefully documented my entire life, stalking quietly, building an imagined relationship, convinced we belonged together. Ethan was securely imprisoned, charged with stalking, harassment, and attempted assault. Yet despite his capture, the scars remained permanent. The bookstore I'd once loved became unbearable, tainted by Ethan's silent obsession and invasion. Eventually, I sold it, unable to escape the trauma he'd caused. Though physically unharmed, emotionally I remained deeply damaged. Trust in safety and normalcy had been shattered permanently. Ethan's quiet, patient stalking and terrifying calmness stayed with me like a shadow, a haunting reminder of how easily normal life could be twisted into a nightmare. No matter where I went afterward, I could never fully escape the memory of Ethan's whispered words and gentle threats. I learned painfully that sometimes the most terrifying threats aren't loud or violent. They move quietly through shadows, patiently waiting, watching silently, until the moment they finally choose to step forward and reveal themselves. When I was 23, fresh out of college, and eager to start life independently, I rented a small, affordable cottage on the edge of a quiet seaside town in Maine. The place was quaint, cozy, and felt like the perfect retreat after years of cramped dorm living. It was isolated enough for privacy, but still close enough to town that I didn't feel completely alone. The first few weeks in my new home were peaceful. I enjoyed daily walks along the rocky beaches, savoring the fresh ocean air and the calming solitude of the empty shorelines. My neighbors, a retired couple, and a young fisherman named Jake, seemed friendly and welcoming. Jake lived closest, just a short walk down the beach. He was quiet but polite, often nodding a greeting when we passed each other on morning strolls. However, my sense of comfort started to unravel slowly, almost imperceptibly. It began one evening after returning from town to find footprints in the sand around my porch, distinctly human, circling slowly around my cottage windows. At first I thought little of it, convincing myself it was simply Jake or someone from town who had wandered by, curious about the new resident. Still, something about the way the prints lingered near each window unsettled me. Over the following days, the feeling of being watched intensified. I'd find subtle clues that someone had been around, flower pots slightly rearranged, curtains disturbed, even a chair moved inches from its usual position on my porch. The incidents felt small enough that reporting them seemed silly, yet each occurrence left me increasingly anxious. Then, late one night, the situation escalated. I had fallen asleep reading, waking suddenly to a soft tapping noise coming from my bedroom window. My heart instantly quickened, my senses alert. Sitting up carefully, I stared at the window, straining to listen. The tapping repeated gently, deliberate and rhythmic, as though whoever was outside wanted me to hear clearly. With trembling hands, I approached the window, parting the curtains just slightly. In the darkness, I saw the faint outline of someone standing directly outside, unmoving, their face obscured by shadow. Terror surged through me instantly. Instinctively I pulled back, stumbling backward and nearly falling. The figure didn't react or move, just continued standing there silently, calmly waiting. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but hesitated. My mind raced. Maybe it was Jake checking if I was all right, or perhaps a neighbor needing help. Forcing courage, I called out nervously through the window, "Who's there?" Silence followed, heavy and oppressive. Just as I began dialing the number for the police, the figure turned slowly and walked away into the darkness, disappearing toward the beach. Sleep was impossible that night. The next morning, I approached Jake nervously, asking if he'd noticed anyone unusual around lately. He shook his head quietly, eyes thoughtful but distant, offering little reassurance. The retired couple down the way hadn't seen anything either, though they promised to keep watch. Days passed quietly afterward. Though I could never fully shake the anxiety, I double-checked locks compulsively, installed motion lights around my porch, and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the worst. Yet despite my precautions, the sense of being watched remained, lingering persistently. Then came a night when all pretense of safety vanished completely. I'd gone to bed early, desperate for sleep after days of restless nights. At around midnight, a sudden noise jolted me awake, A heavy, unmistakable sound of footsteps walking slowly across my wooden porch. My pulse spiked instantly, every muscle tightening in fear. The footsteps moved slowly, confidently, circling my cottage deliberately. Pausing at each window, I lay frozen in bed, barely breathing, listening as the steps approached my front door. Stopping directly outside, silence stretched painfully, broken only by the gentle creaking of the wooden porch beneath shifting weight. Whoever stood outside wasn't leaving. They were waiting, patiently and silently. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I lay frozen, straining to listen. The footsteps remained still, just inches beyond my front door, unmoving yet undeniably present. Seconds felt like hours, the quiet growing heavier and more oppressive with each passing moment. Suddenly, my doorknob rattled softly, as though someone was testing it gently, methodically. I felt nauseous with dread, my pulse skyrocketing. The knob slowly twisted again, this time harder, more insistent. Terrified, I slid silently from my bed, grabbing my phone and desperately dialing 911, whispering urgently to the dispatcher that someone was attempting to enter my home. The dispatcher instructed me to stay calm, hide quietly, and wait for help. Trembling, I slipped into the tiny closet in my bedroom, quietly closing the door, curling into the shadows as silently as possible. My heart pounded deafeningly in my ears as I heard the intruder step away from the front door and slowly circle around the cottage again. Footsteps calm yet deliberate, pausing occasionally near windows, clearly searching for another way inside. Minutes dragged painfully. Finally, flashing lights illuminated the darkness outside my window, police sirens piercing the quiet. Immediately, footsteps retreated quickly from my cottage, fading toward the beach. Officers knocked loudly at my door, moments later, identifying themselves, assuring me it was safe. When I opened the door, officers quickly searched the property and surrounding area. They found clear footprints leading down toward the beach, disappearing into the rocky sand. There was no sign of the intruder, though it was obvious they'd fled into the darkness. Police took my statement seriously, promising increased patrols and reassuring me they were committed to finding whoever was responsible. After they left, sleep was impossible. Each creak of the cottage, each gust of wind outside brought fresh terror. I was exhausted but terrified to close my eyes, afraid that whoever had been outside would return once the police were gone. The next morning, drained and anxious, I stepped outside, noticing Jake walking slowly toward me from his house. He looked unusually nervous, hesitant. As he approached, he paused awkwardly, finally speaking softly. "I think you should know something," he began uneasily. "Last night, just before the cops showed up, I saw someone running past my place. I didn't get a good look, but whoever it was definitely knew this area. They vanished fast." His words sent chills down my spine. Jake's expression was genuinely concerned, his earlier aloofness now replaced by sincere worry. "Whoever this is, they aren't strangers," he continued. "Be careful." His warning deepened my dread. Was it someone local, someone I'd unknowingly interacted with regularly? Unable to stay any longer in constant fear, I quickly packed essentials, deciding to temporarily stay in a nearby hotel. Yet even there, paranoia lingered. I jumped at shadows, checked locks repeatedly, and scanned crowds nervously, convinced the intruder was still watching closely. Days later, police finally identified the suspect through surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store. His name was Tom Hendricks, a local fisherman known for his reclusive and odd behavior. They revealed he'd previously stalked other newcomers, fixating obsessively on people who moved into his territory, silently watching and testing boundaries until he finally attempted to enter their homes. Tom was arrested after a brief search, found hiding quietly on a nearby abandoned property. His capture brought temporary relief, but the trauma remained. My sense of safety had been irreversibly shattered. Eventually, I moved permanently to another town, leaving behind the ocean cottage I'd once loved, now forever tainted by memories of lurking shadows and quiet footsteps circling in the dark. Months passed, Yet anxiety still lingered. The realization that I'd been silently stalked by someone hidden so carefully among ordinary neighbors permanently changed how I viewed trust, safety, and even solitude itself. Though Tom remained securely imprisoned, the haunting knowledge that anyone around me could quietly harbor dangerous obsessions never truly left me. My quiet seaside life, once peaceful, had become a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats don't reveal themselves openly. They linger patiently, silently waiting just outside your window, until darkness provides them the perfect opportunity to strike. When I was 27, I worked as a wildlife photographer, traveling to remote locations to capture rare animals in their natural habitats. I thrived on solitude, often hiking deep into isolated wilderness areas to capture shots few others could. So, when I heard rumors about a small, isolated village in Alaska, known for sightings of a rare white wolf, I jumped at the opportunity to photograph it. Arriving in late autumn, I found the village named Coldwater to be little more than a cluster of rustic cabins and a small general store, surrounded entirely by dense forests and snow-capped mountains. Few outsiders visited Coldwater, especially so close to winter, but the locals were welcoming enough. Though wary of my intentions, I checked into a modest cabin, offered by an elderly man named Henry, who quietly advised me not to wander far from the village at night. Curious about his warning, I asked if it was because of bears or wildlife. Henry hesitated, then shook his head slowly, speaking softly. "No, not bears," he said quietly. "There's something else out there, something people here don't like to discuss openly. Just stay close to the cabins after dark." Intrigued but unconcerned, I spent my first days exploring the stunning landscape, photographing wildlife, and searching for signs of the elusive white wolf. But each evening, as twilight deepened, an unsettling quiet settled over Coldwater. Villagers retreating into their homes, locking doors and drawing curtains tight. One evening, as I returned to my cabin after a long hike, I spotted a figure standing silently at the edge of the trees, watching me carefully. It was a man, thin, disheveled, dressed in heavy layers, but there was something off about his appearance. He was pale, expressionless, and stared openly with unblinking intensity. When I waved nervously, he remained motionless, eyes locked onto mine, refusing to react. Feeling suddenly uncomfortable, I quickly entered my cabin, locking the door securely. Later I asked Henry about the strange man. He grew visibly uneasy, glancing anxiously outside before speaking softly. "That must be Thomas," he murmured quietly. "Used to be a good man, years ago, but he went missing one winter, came back months later, changed. Doesn't speak much now, just wanders the woods. Best you stay clear of him." Henry's words unsettled me further. Despite my unease, the desire to capture the white wolf drove me deeper into the forest each day. But now, each step felt heavier, shadows, darker, the sensation of being watched more intense. Then came the afternoon, when my obsession nearly cost me everything. While following fresh tracks, deep into dense woods, darkness began falling earlier than expected, shadows growing rapidly. Suddenly, I realized I'd wandered too far, completely losing track of my bearings. Panicked, I tried retracing my steps, only growing more lost and disoriented. As the sun dipped below the horizon, night fell swiftly, leaving me stranded in pitch-black wilderness. I used my flashlight sparingly, anxiety surging with every noise around me. Then, just beyond my flashlight beam, I glimpsed movement, a shadow darting quickly between trees. I froze, pulse racing sharply. "Hello," I called shakily. Silence responded, thick and heavy. Moments later, a quiet sound emerged softly through darkness, a low, unsettling chuckle, echoing faintly through trees. Fear spiked violently. Was someone out here deliberately following me? Desperate, I turned quickly, moving hurriedly through darkness, hoping instinct might guide me safely back. But each step felt unfamiliar, every path indistinct. Then, unmistakably, footsteps followed mine closely, matching pace, always just beyond sight. Terror clawed at me, I ran faster, stumbling blindly through dense brush, until, finally, I burst into a small clearing, relief flooding me briefly. But seconds later, my blood turned ice cold again. Standing calmly in the clearing's center was Thomas, watching silently, face pale and expressionless, eyes empty and unblinking. In the faint moonlight, he appeared eerily ghost-like. My heart hammered violently. Before I could speak, Thomas smiled slowly, coldly. "You're lost," he whispered softly, voice chillingly emotionless. "You shouldn't be here." I took a cautious step backward, fear tightening my chest painfully. "I didn't mean to intrude," I stammered nervously. "I'm just trying to find my way back." He tilted his head slightly, continuing to stare intently. "I was lost once too," he murmured calmly. "But now I belong here. Like you soon will." Chills raced down my spine. Without another word, Thomas slowly stepped backward, melting silently into darkness. Terrified, I desperately searched again for any familiar path, heart pounding violently. After stumbling blindly for what felt like hours, exhaustion overwhelmed me, forcing me to stop. I built a small fire for warmth, shivering uncontrollably, trapped in darkness until dawn. Each crack of branches or rustle of leaves sent fresh panic surging through me, yet nothing approached openly again. At first light, I finally recognized my surroundings, quickly retracing my way back to Coldwater. Exhausted and shaken to the core, Henry and the other villagers seemed deeply relieved to see me safe, but visibly disturbed when I mentioned encountering Thomas. They quietly explained he had once been respected, but had returned from his disappearance obsessed with keeping others away from the deep woods, believing himself the forest guardian. But something about Thomas still haunted me. The chilling calmness, his empty stare, and the whispered warning, "Like you soon will." I realized he hadn't simply been trying to scare me. He genuinely believed the forest claimed anyone who wandered too far, forever binding them to its darkness. Though physically unharmed, I left Coldwater days later, never photographing the white wolf. Instead, I carried home permanent memories of fear, reminders that some places in the wilderness aren't merely isolated. They're quietly watched over by people forever lost, waiting silently for others to share their fate. Months passed after my terrifying experience in Coldwater. I'd returned home, attempting to resume my normal life as a photographer. But no matter how far away I traveled, memories of Thomas's cold, empty stare and chilling words haunted me relentlessly. His quiet warning lingered constantly. "Like you soon will." It felt like a curse I couldn't escape. Eventually, I decided I had to face my fears head on. I began researching Coldwater and Thomas obsessively, determined to uncover the truth behind his strange behavior and disappearance years earlier. The few available details painted a disturbing picture. Thomas had vanished one harsh winter, while exploring deeper into the wilderness, only reappearing months later. Changed profoundly. Locals believed something traumatic had happened to him in those isolated forests, warping him into the silent, haunting figure I'd encountered. My curiosity deepened into obsession. I contacted Henry again, seeking answers. After some hesitation, Henry revealed quietly that Thomas had once spoken about discovering something terrifying deep within the forest, something he claimed protected itself fiercely and didn't allow visitors to leave unchanged. Thomas believed it had chosen him, binding him forever to the wilderness, compelling him to guard it against intruders. Though skeptical, Henry urged me strongly to forget Coldwater and Thomas altogether, but I couldn't let it go. Thomas's warning felt too personal, too deliberate, as though he had sensed something in me, perhaps predicting I'd return someday, driven by a need to confront whatever dark secret haunted those woods. Against all advice, I eventually returned to Coldwater 1 year after my first visit, determined to uncover the truth. Villagers were shocked by my appearance, warning me immediately to stay away from Thomas and the deeper forest. But driven by stubborn determination, I ignored their warnings completely, once more venturing into the dense wilderness alone. This time I was prepared. Maps, GPS, supplies, everything I needed to survive. Yet the forest seemed darker, quieter, almost expectant as I hiked steadily deeper. Each step filled me with increasing dread. Hours passed in silence, until finally, I reached the clearing where I'd last seen Thomas. My heart hammered violently as I scanned the area nervously, sensing I wasn't alone. Just then, Thomas emerged silently from the trees, exactly as before, calm, pale, eyes wide and expressionless. He stared at me knowingly, unsurprised by my return. "You came back," he murmured softly, voice chillingly calm. "I knew you would. You belong here." Determined to confront him, I spoke firmly. "What happened to you, Thomas? What's in this forest?" He tilted his head slightly, gaze never leaving mine. "I found it by accident," he replied quietly, emotionlessly. "It chose me, like it's chosen you. It doesn't like visitors, but once it claims you, it never lets you leave." Confused yet defiant, I demanded again, "What are you talking about? There's nothing here but trees and wildlife." Thomas shook his head slowly, calmly stepping closer. "Look around, feel it. It's watching you even now." Suddenly, a cold wind blew softly through the clearing, sending chills crawling violently down my spine. For the first time, I noticed the forest around us felt alive, alert, almost breathing, silently observing our encounter. Thomas's gaze grew colder, more intense. "It wants us to protect it," he whispered quietly. "No one else must find it." Panic surged sharply. Without warning, Thomas lunged suddenly toward me, gripping my arms tightly, eyes wide and wild. I struggled desperately against his hold, realizing in horror he intended to keep me there permanently, believing the forest had chosen me too. "You can't leave," he shouted frantically. "We belong here. It demands it." In blind desperation, I fought violently, finally breaking free and stumbling backward. Thomas lunged again, but I evaded him, turning swiftly to flee through dense trees, heart pounding painfully, fear driving each step. I raced through endless darkness, hearing Thomas pursue closely behind, voice pleading yet terrifyingly frantic. "Don't run, it'll find you again. You can never escape it." But I refused to stop, adrenaline fueling my flight. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the outskirts of cold water, collapsing exhausted into villagers' startled arms, babbling incoherently about Thomas and the living forest. They looked deeply troubled, exchanging fearful glances, clearly believing I'd encountered the same sinister force Thomas once had. I left cold water immediately, never returning again. Police searched thoroughly but never found Thomas again. Yet villagers remained certain he still roamed those woods, forever bound to the mysterious presence he claimed inhabited them.